Thank you for joining me today. We're going to be talking about an interesting topic that has come up more and more often in my own work and in research, and I'm hoping popular culture starts to pick this up as well. We're going to be talking about how marijuana is ruining our children's brains. That might sound a little dramatic, but just give me a moment and I'll get into it a little more. So for those that are unaware of marijuana, it's going to be important to know. You should. If you don't know, you're either lying or you haven't been paying attention. There's a whole lot of different names that I'll use throughout this whole podcast. One, because I find it funny, and two, there's just so many names. It would be a crime to not list them all. So marijuana, the devil's lettuce. A little bit of history on it first. It's a plant. It's a Schedule I narcotic, which means from the federal level, it's prosecuted the same way as something like heroin. If you know the difference between marijuana and heroin, you will quickly be confused. It's a whole other argument for a different time. But marijuana is a plant. It's come over from a lot of different places. It comes through Mexico and South America mostly is where it's transported, although it can be grown pretty much anywhere here in the U.S. Marijuana is something that can cause psychoactive effects, different ones depending on how much you use in the different strain that you use. There's two general strains, although I think some of the different effects have to do with more placebo than anything else. The history of marijuana has had some differences in both public and criminal attitudes. Early on, without a whole lot of experience open to the public, marijuana was seen as this overt and deadly thing. It was viewed, especially by the government, as something that had to be drilled into the ground. The war on drugs, for a lot of its history, had to do with marijuana. It's an uncomfortable truth that in my dissertation I've written and researched about, that the war on drugs, first off, if there was a war, the drugs won, but it's something that was seen as very severe by the community and the government. Now, those attitudes have changed over the years. One of the big reasons that there's been a shift in attitude towards marijuana actually has to do with musicians. Let's say Willie Nelson and Snoop Dogg. If you don't know who those people are, I'd encourage you to pause the podcast and go look them up. But they have been two of the big moving forces, as well as just popular culture in general, where it was taken from this taboo thing into this more mainstream thing that we joke about. Another interesting point about marijuana history has to do with how well we in the West are able to genetically modify plants. Now, I don't mean that we're splicing DNA. I mean through selective breeding of plants. You can increase the natural potency of it by selectively breeding. We've done this with things like, if you want to look it up, corn and watermelons. We've been able to manipulate how a plant grows and what it produces just through selective breeding. So that's some of the history. It's mostly been a plant. You take it and process it, and I'm not going to go into all the little details, but you put it in a form that can be rolled up in paper and smoked pretty easily. But what does that have to do with today? Well, what has been a plant has shifted. And I guess mostly the past, I would say maybe 5 years at most, is where we've seen the biggest growth. Instead of just smoking a marijuana plant, the THC, the active ingredient that gives the psychoactive effects, has been used in vapes, vaporized products. Some of the common names for this are called vape pens or vape carts, which is short for cartridges. And you call a marijuana vape a pen a lot of times because it can look like a pen, and the cartridges because there's little cartridges that you place in different things. There's also a wax and some other ways that you can use it. The important thing is this type of ingestion of, it's not exactly marijuana, it's THC, the active ingredient in marijuana that gets you high. It's shifted from that plant into this very broken down form, and it's created a few problems. But marijuana isn't where the vaping started. If anybody has gone back and looked through the history of vaping, there's this company called Juul, Juul, and there's plenty of documentaries on Juul where they pioneered the technology to be able to take active ingredients in tobacco, the nicotine, and break it down into its salt form. It's a chemical thing that just means that you can create high levels of concentrate with a specific substance. Now, that's incredibly useful in terms of marketing and the production of a product, because you can take a whole lot of nicotine and cram it into a small amount of space. The initial appeal of vaping was to engage nicotine without all the harmful side effects, the tar and all the other carcinogens, all that stuff. The problem is that some people, very few people in retrospect, have used vapes to either reduce harm or reduce their intake of nicotine over time. There's been a whole subsection, and I wouldn't even call it a subsection at this point. There's a whole group of people that have just used that as a way to raise their nicotine intake. Well, why would they be able to do that? With cigarettes and with smoking marijuana, there have been some ways that you have slowed down the level of nicotine or THC you take in. With smoking, and with smoking weed especially, there's the cough. You take it in, and you can only take so much before your body pushes back. This coughing is actually a natural gatekeeping mechanism that limits the amount that you can intake. Without this slow down mechanism, you would be able to ingest a whole lot more, which is what vaping does. See, those salt forms of those chemicals are incredibly important because you can get the active ingredient without the smoke, without all of the other major side effects. Now, there are still obviously side effects. Popcorn lung is one of the things that's been really concerning for some people, although it's obviously less than lung cancer. So, without that restriction, you can take in high levels of THC and nicotine with none of the things that slow you down. Something else important to know about vaping: it's really easy to hide. I'm not going to go into all of the specifics about how people hide it, because if there's a teenager listening, I don't want to give them ideas. But there's ways to inhale vaping without really any vapor. Or if it is, it's really minimal. So you can take in a lot of this stuff without actually showing smoke. It's not incredibly difficult to do, but it also takes away one of the other restrictions, which is other people noticing. See, when you smoke marijuana or you smoke tobacco, there's the obvious smoke that lingers. If you can use a vape in a way that doesn't outpour the smoke, it's another restriction that has gone away. Something else to know about this whole vaping world, especially around THC: it is mostly unregulated. Now, I'm not a fan of Big Brother government. However, there's something important here that is good to know. We've gotten really good at changing chemical makeups of drugs and of substances in a way that's not meaningfully different, although the chemical itself is technically different. You see this in things like Delta 8 and Delta 9. What does that mean? It's just THC with a slight chemical change. Well, why does that matter? Because federal regulations only restrict THC specifically. But if you change the chemical makeup ever so slightly, it dodges regulations. This is huge in the supplement industry where certain things are banned. You slightly change the chemical and all of a sudden the laws don't apply. That's a whole rabbit hole of legal framework that we don't have the time to get into, but you can see where there are issues. Now you can find Delta 8, Delta 9, THC, whatever you want to go for. You can find it on gas station corners. You can find it online pretty easily. And all you have to do is mark a little checkbox that says, oh, yes, I'm of age. And we all know how online verification goes. You just check the checkbox and all of a sudden the website is no longer liable for selling or showing something to someone underage. The gas stations and the little convenience stores, if you're in somewhat of a metropolitan area, you've seen these start to pop up more and more. And their big sell is, we sell glassware, we sell all of these things, but if you pay attention, the main driver of their income is not glassware. It's not paraphernalia. It's vapes and substances. So what we have started to find is that there's been a significant increase in the amount of THC. I'll see if I can link one of the articles that I read recently around this. But marijuana has been increasing to such a degree that it has overtaken alcohol in daily use in the general population. Now, to some people, that sounds great. Well, if it's legal and we found a way around it, what does it matter if people use it? The big problem is, at least on my side of the aisle, is we don't know exactly what it's going to do to people yet. We're just on the cusp of having this high a level of concentration. The other thing is a lot of THC users or Delta 8 or Delta 9 users, they also use nicotine. It's not always an isolated thing. So you have people who use high levels of marijuana, the active ingredient, and high levels of tobacco together, just without all the cancer that comes with it. All right. So you've gotten a basic understanding of why this is an issue, where all of this could come from. Now, what does this have to do with our children? One of the biggest things that I think is important to understand, our brains are not completely developed until around 25 or 26. Now, that doesn't mean that sections of our brains are missing. What it does mean is that our brain hasn't filled every single nook and cranny that it possibly could. That's not to excuse poor behavior, because your brain hasn't developed. If you're breathing, if you're walking, if you're interacting, you have responsibility, okay? But if our brains aren't fully developed, then it's easier to affect their structure and how they help or harm us. With high levels of nicotine and THC, you can alter brain chemistry before that age. Why does this matter? Well, one of the things that I've seen in research, and I'll try to link this one as well, is that if you use high levels of nicotine, but especially THC, before the age of 26, there is a chance that you will have anxiety and depression either brought on or made worse that could last for the rest of your life. Put in simple terms, you could give yourself an anxiety disorder that you might not have otherwise had. Let me put that in a slightly different thing. You could permanently make your mental health worse for the rest of your life because of repeated use of THC. Look, I'm not a part of the DARE program, okay? The DARE program was wildly ineffective, a waste of tax dollars, and actually increased use by, I think, 1% because it misunderstood or just didn't pay attention to how kids actually think. Kids have a problem understanding long-term consequences. But the thing is, with nicotine, with THC and vapes, those consequences don't matter because it's so easily accessible. And I talked about before, you can just check some little boxes or Kids know the right places to go to where they'll sell vapes underage. It's also unrestricted by the government, and it's also, a lot of cases that I've seen, unrestricted by parents. They simply do not understand the impact that this can have, that their child can have an increase of anxiety or depression or cause it simply by continued use. It's something that, quote unquote, all the kids do. They don't all, but it's prevalent enough that we see it. People just don't know. Parents just don't understand. Again, I'm not a doom and gloom guy. I'm just looking at the research going, oh, this is going to be really bad. For a lot of kids, they don't actually buy the vapes. They take hits off their friends. You're there at school and you guys are at the bathroom at the same time. And it's just some random coincidence, or it's before or after school or out with some people. Something that's important to know is sharing these vapes or letting one person take a hit off of it is pretty common. And so you get a lot of this stuff unrestricted. This nicotine, this THC use is also really hard to stop at school. Why? Because schools can get pretty big. We all know the problems in school and regulating behavior. And if you've never seen a vape before, they can be really, really small. I remember in high school all of those years ago that you could smoke a vape and drop it into the sweatshirt pocket that you had, or even into your sleeve. They're so easy to hide that in order to find them all, you'd probably need a specific drug sniffing dog and pat downs of people's bags, and even themselves sometimes. So it's easy to transport. Parents don't know about it, and schools have a really hard time dealing with it. But let me give you some of the more significant long-term mental health issues. Because of this high level of concentration, you can get side effects that you wouldn't otherwise get with just marijuana itself in the plant form, okay? In my own work, and it's emerging more in research, there are some people who have had psychotic episodes after the use of high levels of THC. Psychosis here means delusional beliefs, whether that there's something in front of you that does not exist, or you hear something, or you feel something, or you have this newfound understanding of the world that's detached from reality. That's all psychosis. And so if you take in a lot of THC and you're susceptible to mental health disorders, there is a chance that you could either experience a short moment of psychosis or it could continue. Now, from what I've seen, it hasn't been permanent. I'm sure there are some fringe cases, but for the most part, those that are susceptible to this, it tends to be a short-term episode. Does that mean the consequences don't matter? No. That can almost cause injury to the brain to where you can have continued issues with other things. It's likely those that experience the psychosis have other vulnerabilities to things like bipolar or schizophrenia, but still, you don't exactly know what will happen at high levels of THC. Again, not a DARE program. I'm just letting you know what the research says. Something else that's important to know. These high levels of THC use come with some stereotypes. Some of them are very true. Those that smoke a whole lot of weed carry the stereotype that they don't do anything. They just sit on their couch all day, smoke weed, and play video games. To some degree, that's true. High levels of THC can cause problems with motivation and participation in school. If this drug makes me feel good and helps me detach from things, why would I need to engage here? And so you create this cycle of, I'm not motivated to do anything. Well, what can I do if I'm not motivated to do anything? I know, like a vape. Wow, that makes me feel good, and it's stolen the motivation for other things in my life. Why should I participate in school? This is stupid and everything's pointless. It can also cause family issues because when you are engaged with the THC use, and if we're being honest here, I think more kids are addicted than we're comfortable admitting. It can cause other severe issues, especially within a family, because if your emotions are all chucked into this substance and they're detached from family and relationships and these other things, someone can appear to be, quote unquote, okay with something when really they're just numb to it. I will say for some of these mental health issues, we just don't know exactly what the long-term effects are going to be. I have some suspicions. One, I do think that those long-term mental health side effects are going to keep showing up. I think people are also going to have trouble with concentration, focusing on tasks and considering long-term outcomes. How permanent is that going to be? I don't know. Again, we're talking about marijuana use in children and teenagers. How much of that is being a teenager and how much of these issues are brought on or made worse by THC? We don't know, but I will say as a therapist and a researcher, I'm really concerned. I'm very concerned with how easy it is to access, not just on the internet, but with friends, and how prevalent it is if you drive down the road in any sort of non-rural area that you can see it just freely available. So what do we do? Number one, at least in my home state of Tennessee, vaping is regulated to the age of 21. Does that matter? Sort of. It's one of those things where it's become so prevalent that do we really want to prosecute it? Do we really want to arrest for it? Do we really want to do citations for it? Because if we do, we have a gigantic task in front of us. If there are any parents listening, know that it is illegal and know that your student can get expelled for it. Even if all of the administrators know that there are vapes everywhere, if a student is caught with it, they can get expelled. For those that didn't know that, it's a very real thing. I've had clients over the years that have faced that potential consequence because it is illegal. Technically, it's an illegal substance that has been brought into a school. So for anyone who's thinking about, okay, well, how do we make this not so bad? It cannot be at school. Cannot be at school because so many other things can fall apart through that, including college scholarships, extracurricular activities, friends, all of those things. Remember, it is illegal. So if you don't want your kids to have it, it's pretty straightforward. They can't have it. Now, what does that look like for you? Does that look like searching things or just asking your kids up front? I don't know. That's something you're going to have to evaluate with them. I will say, in my opinion, as a therapist and researcher, the best option of use is zero. I don't think anybody should be using this stuff because it's not tested, it's not regulated, and a lot of the manufacturers are playing peekaboo with federal regulators. We just don't know what it is, and there's no way to test it. And quite honestly, there's not much of a point because this isn't just a little bit of marijuana. It incentivizes very high concentrations of it. I would also encourage any adults and parents that are listening, talk about this openly with your kids. Chances are they already know. Even as early as middle school, kids already know about this stuff. Some kids, unfortunately, are even using it. So it's going to be important to have an open conversation. If it's a zero tolerance thing for you guys, make it a zero tolerance thing in your home. If it's found, there are consequences because it's important to remember these things are easy to hide. If you find one, there's probably more elsewhere. Okay. These consequences in home are important because if they start using in a significant long-term way, they can get caught at school or they could lose out on future opportunities, employment, or goals in their lives because their motivation is stolen from them. It's going to be important, if you're wanting to intervene on this, to check in with your kids about social influences and friends that they have. Social media can be an easy way to sell these things. There's an underground black market amongst teenagers for those that can access it and those who can't but want it. So it's going to be important to talk to your kids about the friends that they have. I'm going to say it one more time. I am not a DARE program. I'm not calling it the devil's lettuce because we're talking about vapes and it's not even green anymore. But this is going to have a real issue, and I'm betting within the next 5 to 10 years, we start seeing more research about it, or we start seeing more stories about it. So for any parents that have made it this far, you should be concerned. Your kid might not overdose, but they will passively start losing things along the way. Whether that's hope for the future, whether that's their mental health or relationships, I would encourage you to step in now, create a plan for sobriety, complete and total sobriety now, so you don't see how things play on later on in life. Thank you for listening today. I hope that you got something useful for you, something that could be helpful to some of the younger people in your life, especially if that's kids. If you found this useful, I hope that you share the podcast with those that could benefit from it. And if you feel the need, you can leave something in the tip jar to help pay for production. But follow the podcast as we go through topics like this every week to help you improve your own life and help those around you as well.